Okay, so welcome back to Copcast. Today our guest is Phil Gurski, former CSIS operative, and you're a prolific writer, Phil, and tell me a little bit about Borealis, what you're doing currently.
Yeah, well, listen, Jim, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's quite an honor for me to be here. So, Borealis is something that I started when I retired from the public service back in 2015. So, I spent 32 years in intelligence in Canada, kind of split kind of 50-50 between Communications Security Establishment, or CSE, which Canada Signals Intelligence Organization. Very, very secretive bunch of people that Canadians don't know a lot about. Started my career during the Cold War, when we're still worried about Soviet bombers coming over the Arctic, and ended my career serendipitously just before 9/11. I joined CSIS in 2001 in January, and then 9/11 happened in, of course, September of that year, and my career went incredibly sideways after that in terms of my focus. When I retired from the civil service in 2015, I decided that I wanted to create Borealis. Basically, I call it more as a hobby, Jim. I wanted to remain active in the field, obviously not from an intelligence perspective, because I no longer had access to intelligence. But I wanted to use my experience in looking at especially terrorism to help people understand the threat, what it consists of, where it is, how serious it is, and thereby had some success in providing advice to private sector largely, who wanted to know more about the phenomenon and what it meant for their businesses. And it's been fairly successful. So it's been coming up to 8 years, and it'll be in May that'll be 8 years that Borealis has been around. The other side, of course, of Borealis is the sort of the information that I provide to the public. And not only have you said I've been a prolific writer, but I've done hundreds of podcasts, thousands of interviews with Canadian international television, radio, podcasts as well, to help people to understand national security, understand intelligence, especially in a Canadian context. And most importantly, again, going back to the terrorist threat, something I worked on very closely at CSIS for almost 15 years, to gain a better understanding as to what terrorism is and what it means. There's an awful lot of information out there, I find. A lot of people, different perspectives, different backgrounds, academics, former practitioners, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the information is great. A lot of it is absolute crap when it comes to people's inability to understand the nature of the threat. They either embellish it or they understate it, especially this government right now. It's an interesting question we should broach at some point, is how does the current Canadian government view terrorism? I think they're getting most of it wrong, personally. But so that's basically Borealis in a nutshell. I always knew I wanted to go public, but in a positive way, not a whistleblower or the old curmudgeon who leaves the intelligence service and points fingers at everything that's wrong with it. I had an incredibly fortunate career over more than 3 decades, and if I can help Canadians gain a bit of an understanding of what this world's all about, and more importantly, the important role it plays in keeping us all safe, that's what I want to do.
Okay, so we'll talk about that. And just beside me is Craig Peddle, a longtime friend of mine, and worked with Toronto Police Intelligence for some time. So he's just sitting and co-hosting. So we're going to fire some questions at you.
But fire away.
Yeah. So you said understated, and so there's a couple things. We spoke about the Cold War. I think we're roughly the same era. I remember duck and cover and this type of thing. But again, you look at the Russian Revolution. After that, sort of the start of communism, 1921, China takes on the similar type of communism, and it starts to spread. We look at the end of the Second World War, and we see the development of Eastern Bloc, Eastern Europe. Again, communist. We go to the Korean War. Communist threat. NATO forces push the threat back to the Yellow River, and then 3 million Chinese, military come across the border and push them all the way back. So then we're now into Vietnam. We're into the domino theory. Again, I don't think a lot of younger people understand this, but then you get Cambodia, and they all fall eventually. And what's interesting is Ho Chi Minh was actually trained by the OSS.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of used the things against us eventually. So then again, we're into the Cold War through the 60s and 70s. And we saw into the 80s the invasion of Afghanistan by Russians. And what my concern is that now we're focused on the Ukraine and Russia. Certainly that is a considerable problem. But with that said, it seems like China is playing the long game and surreptitiously through, again, what we're reading in the media, having police stations in North America where national Chinese have to report when they come here to go to school or something, a work visa perhaps. Then again, we're seeing now possibly them influencing Canadian politics. So can you expand on that?
How much time do we have?
Limited time, but if you could just. So let me ask you this, because I was thinking about it the other night. It's my understanding from what I'm reading in the paper, and these are my sources in the news. They don't have papers anymore. But when CSIS has some information, do they go to the RCMP or do they go directly to our government? And does the government exercise parliamentary privilege with that information?
Okay. Wow, you've opened up an amazing conversation here, Jim. We could probably talk for weeks about this thing. I'll just simply say that those that forget their history are condemned to repeat it. I was in Moscow in the early 2000s after 9/11 when we saw the Russians as a partner in counterterrorism. I don't think we see them as a partner anymore. And given what Putin is doing in Ukraine, that certainly is consistent with Russian and Soviet intentions over the better part of, a few centuries. Same thing with China. You're absolutely right. I think people are naive. We here in Canada are woefully ignorant when it comes to threat, largely because we don't see threat. We don't perceive it as being part of us. We haven't been invaded since 1812, unless you count the Fenian invasion of 1866, which is a book I'm writing right now, actually, is on the Fenians from the 1860s. The way that CSIS works is very simple. CSIS collects intelligence under its mandate. So the CSIS Act was passed by Parliament in 1984. Of course, CSIS came out of the old RCMP Security Service. When it was decided we needed a civilian, not law enforcement approach to intelligence, other countries look at it very differently. The Scandinavian countries, for example, combine their police services and security intelligence services, as do the New Zealanders of all things. What that means is that CSIS collects information from a variety of sources. It assesses the accuracy of those sources. It confirms their reliability. It corroborates where it can. And then it can provide the information to whomever has the ubiquitous need to know, which is, government speak for, do you have the proper clearance? And is this information something you absolutely need to help you with your particular responsibilities? So when I worked at CSE and CSIS, we would pass intelligence regularly to clients within the government of Canada. Our main clients, probably not surprisingly, were global affairs or external affairs or whatever the heck we're calling it these days. It seems to change names every 5 minutes. The Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, Department of National Defense. And that's intelligence to help Canada understand what we call foreign intelligence, which are the intents and capabilities of foreign states. So, for example, if we're negotiating a free trade agreement with country X, if we have intelligence on the position of country X, that's going to help Canada's negotiation posture. Basically, it's a heads up for what you may come down the road. When I moved to CSIS, they've got a little bit different. Part of that, I think, is the historical relationship between CSIS and the RCMP. The fact that CSIS collects security intelligence and not foreign intelligence largely. So it does relate to the possibility of criminality on our soil. So CSIS can basically pass information onto the RCMP, but in a very limited fashion. And there are reasons for that. First of all, it's intelligence, not evidence. It's not collected to the same evidentiary standard that law enforcement uses in Canada, which means it does not stand up in court. Okay, it can't be used by the prosecution, by the Crown in a court case because it's not evidence. Secondly, CSIS wants to protect its sources and methods at the same time. If there's one thing that's sacrosanct about intelligence, and one thing I've maintained to this day, even with the thousands of interviews I've done with the CBC, CTV Global, et cetera, is I never disclose sources or methods. because you disclose sources and methods, they disappear the next day. And let me just tell you a little bit an anecdote, Jim, to sort of illustrate this. I won't give the year, I won't give the target, I won't give the partner, but at one point we had some damning intelligence about one country's involvement in terrorism, and a leading politician decided to tell the media about the nature of that information. It came from a very sensitive source, and guess what happened to that sensitive source? It disappeared.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
Because it could only have come from that one source. So
correct, yeah.
The source simply dried up, and we lost a great source of intelligence. The other thing that CSIS does is it's very careful that the information it shares with the RCMP is essentially minimal in nature. It's more of a, if I could use an informal term, it's more like nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Right.
Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Jim Bremer is a problem.
Okay, well, some people will tell you that.
Well, yeah, and I've heard that through my source, which I believe to be reliable. And that's as far as the conversation goes, because again, contrary to what people might think in Canada, CSIS and the RCMP never do joint investigations. Right. For the aforementioned reasons. CSIS doesn't collect evidence; it collects intelligence. It complicates matters. In fact, there's a court case that just finished up in Ottawa, where the defendant ended up pleading guilty to terrorism charges. But at one point, the defense was going after the fact that an RCMP agent used to be a CSIS source, which happens on occasion. They cross the floor, and the defense wanted access to CSIS records. Now, if the judge had okayed that, there's a very good chance the Crown would have dropped the case, because CSIS does not want its information to appear in court. Now, CSIS can continue its own investigation in parallel to the RCMP, but for other reasons. So the RCMP is going after Jim because they think he's involved in X, Y, or Z. But at the same time, CSIS knows that Craig is Jim's best friend. And the RCMP may not be pursuing Craig, but we want to pursue Craig to see exactly what he's up to. And I've definitely seen cases where, looking at person A and person B comes along, kind of a peripheral character, and person B ends up being a lot more dangerous than person A. So that's why you do intelligence investigations, to suss out who's who in the zoo, what parts do they play, how important are they, and what threat do they pose to national security, as defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act.
Yeah, I guess my concern, again, in the headlines, is that CSIS brought to this concern about China infiltrating Canadian politics to Parliament, and the government of the day kind of, again, from what I'm reading, brushed it aside. And that's concerning.
And it should be. Because this information, okay, we're talking about 2019, 2021 elections, yes. Allegations that China interfered. Jim, CSIS has been warning about this for 30 years.
Oh, I have no doubt.
And has been ignored for 30 years by multiple governments of both sides of the floor. This speaks to a much greater problem here in Canada. One is that we don't have the intelligence culture that many of our allies do, like the Americans and the UK. They understand what intelligence is and what it's used for. We also have a government that doesn't see threat for what it is. We already talked about that. We haven't been threatened. So is China really a threat? Oh, and by the way, we can make billions in trade with China. So why upset the apple cart by accusing the Chinese of having police stations you refer to, probably recruiting Canadians to interfere with politicians, get the vote out, et cetera, et cetera. And so intelligence is inconvenient because it may go against the programs that you have in place and the things that you hold dear. And as a result, you pretend it's not there. Or, as we've seen, it's not reliable. And I've seen academics go on TV and say, well, it's intelligence, it doesn't count. Yes, it counts. It's just because it's intelligence doesn't make it any difference than what the police collected evidence. The only difference is in the court of law, whereby you can't use intelligence to lay charges. You need evidence for that matter. Aside from that, information is information. It can be human source. It can be SIGINT, or it can be warrants. It could be surveillance. It could be imagery. Information is simply information, and it's only as good as the reliability of the source of that information. So we've got all this information that's been carefully vetted by CSIS for many, many years, and people are dismissing it. And as a consequence, China's laughing all the way to the bank when it comes to Canada.
Well, I think my greatest concern on this topic, and you mentioned it already, is it doesn't seem that people have a sense of history anymore or follow it. And I believe that's why they don't feel threatened. No. But in 2020, I do a lot of posting, as you know, and I was posting the premature takeover of Hong Kong where they were seizing businesses and there was riots in the street, but I didn't have any comments. I simply posted imagery, hoping that somebody would come back and say, this is a threat to people's freedoms. Right. And I don't, again, I don't, when I go to Europe, people have a lot more concerns based on the recent history about this than Canadians do. And I find it alarming that people are not concerned about their liberty or freedom.
It is alarming. And again, it's us as Canadians. I think for the longest time, we always felt, well, we're next door to the United States. They're our biggest ally, our biggest trading partner, our historical friend. If anything goes wrong, the Americans are going to take care of us. They wouldn't allow a presence on our soil that poses the threat to them, which makes you really wonder, Jim, what the Americans are thinking now about us here in Canada. You've got a government that has actively ignored the Chinese threat for decades. We have a government that's dismissing criticism of China as anti-Asian racism, which it is nothing of the sort. We're not talking about Chinese Canadians. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party and its efforts to interfere in our elections and affect our politics. Can you imagine what the Americans are saying? Like, is Canada even a reliable partner anymore? Should we be sharing sensitive intelligence on China with Canada if they're going to be ignoring it? If we don't know what MPs' allegiances are? And I'm not trying to scaremonger at it here. Don't get me wrong, guys.
Yeah.
But it's just that, we're part of the Five Eyes relationship. Yep. It's been the greatest club in intelligence history. It's been around since the Second World War. We have many more partners outside of the Five Eyes. So we at CSIS were allowed to enter into what's called Section 17 agreements, the part of the CSIS Act. We had partners around the world, especially on counterterrorism, but also on counterintelligence. And we're a net importer of intelligence. We're good at what we do. I think historically we punched above our weight, but we are limited in terms of the amount of resources, in terms of money and people we pour into intelligence gathering. So we get most of our intelligence from our allies. And if our allies say, that's not the Canada we used to work with, they're dismissing stuff, maybe we start turning the taps off a little bit. I don't want to be alarmist, but I'm sure those conversations are being held in Washington and London right now.
Well, I found it interesting that Biden had a visit recently, and the PMO's office changed their tune on a number of things that concern the United States.
I wonder if you read them the Riot Act. Yeah.
It's like Biden comes in to send a message, or this is what's going to happen. Not unlike the trucker protests, this has to end now, because it's the economy and everything else. So I love Canada, obviously, but I think worldwide, we have to know our place at times and what we kind of can't do.
I think so. I agree with you on that.
Again, Craig spent a lot of time on intelligence, and I'm just going to ask his opinion. But intelligence is a good thing because Toronto Police is intelligence driven.
Yeah. Right, 100%. Nice to meet you, Phil.
Yeah, you too, Craig.
And what you said, 99% of what you said really resonated with me, particularly when you talked about apathy, and particularly when you talked about reliability. Let's talk about the latter first. So my question is reliability in the intelligence world, in law enforcement, federal or municipal or provincial. We have this adage that we use intelligence to gather the best evidence. So there's a rigorous process, as you know, I don't have to tell you.
Yeah.
There's a rigorous process where we attempt to prove reliability.
Yeah. And
I think that's lost on the general public. So without giving away any trade secrets, Phil, how does CSIS differ perhaps from law enforcement in the proving of reliability of source information?
It's a great question, Craig. I don't think our methods are all that different, actually. The old saying in real estate is location, location, location. Well, the old saying in intelligence is corroboration, corroboration, corroboration. Any one source can lie, be it a human source or whatever, because they have a vested interest or they want to lead you astray. There's been many stories of sources that have hidden their true intent from their handlers. And in some cases, it ends badly. I'm thinking of a case in Afghanistan. I don't remember when it was. It was in the 2010 sometime, where the Americans had a source that they're using to run into, into Taliban networks to see who's who. And it turns out the person was actually pro-Taliban, and he was called in for a meeting with his handlers, and he blew them up, which speaks to, I guess, security protocols that were or were not adhered to at that point.
I recall that incident now that you mention it.
Yeah. Or look at Curveball, the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction back in 2002, right? He clearly lied about weapons of mass destruction. It's not 100%, Craig. Obviously, you do have tools that you can use. You can recruit multiple sources into the same element or the same cell or group. We did that with the Toronto 18 back in 2005, 2006. We had at least 3 human sources infiltrate that cell. So you're getting 3 different disparate views that are not relying on each other. Wiretaps, what we call Section 21 warrants, what you call Part 6 warrants, are obviously quite good. We used to joke in SIGINT that if every conversation you listen to, you can ignore the first 5 minutes, because the first 5 minutes they say, oh, no, we're probably being monitored, we're probably being copied, shh, don't say anything sensitive. And after the first 5 minutes, people forget where they are, and that's where all the good stuff comes out. And humans are humans. So you and I are having a conversation, and you keep saying, Phil, don't talk about this, and this, and I'm not getting. You said, listen, I'm talking about Soares birdstone or something. Oh, that's the one you're talking about. That's just the way that humans operate. So I think the key to establishing, confirming reliability is multiple sources, but not just multiple human sources, but corroborating it from different sources. So you have surveillance teams that can, confirm that target went from A to B and met with person C. You can, that includes photographs. You can rely on intelligence and information from allies. So in many cases, like this recent case in Montreal, where an ISIS guy was picked up, apparently that was based on an FBI tip. I have no idea what the RCMP did or did not know. I have no idea what CSIS knew or didn't know. But the FBI basically picked up the phone and said, hey, we got a guy in Montreal. He's linked to some guys we've been following. You think you might want to take a look at him? And he was arrested, and he was placed on a peace bond, I believe, for wanting to join ISIS to carry out terrorism in Canada. I wish I could say it. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
What do you think of releasing an individual that's suspected on terrorism on a peace bond?
I got one name for you, Jim. Aaron Driver, back in 2016.
Yeah, actually, I worked that case. I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, 2016, back in Strathroy.
Yeah. Here's
an ISIS wannabe. You probably couldn't organize a piss up in a bar on a good day. So they put him on a peace bond, and then when they all of a sudden he makes a video where he pledges allegiance to Islamic State, and the police end up in Strathroy, which is very near from where I'm from in London.
Oh, okay.
Show up at his house, and he's getting into the back of a cab, and like holy shit, and then he made 2 very, very bad bombs. Why were they bad? Well, one blew up in the backseat of the cab, didn't even hurt the cabbie, although I understand he leant down to tie his shoe or something when the bomb went off, so that probably helped. But the bottom line is that he was placed on a peace bond, which it's a tool. I get it, but it basically allows you to keep doing what you're doing. Obviously, you're monitored. It's harder to do certain things on a peace bond, like engage in communications with people. But Aaron Driver clearly posed a threat to public safety. And let's face it, guys. Had he not been picked up in Strathroy that day, he was getting in a cab, probably to head down to London. To probably get on a bus or a train to Toronto. My understanding is that his target was Union Station. Now, again,
you're accurate in that.
Yeah. So again, his bombs were shitty, but if you let off even a shitty bomb at Union Station at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, when all the GO trains are disgorging their people from Scarborough and and Mississauga and points east and west and north, you're going to cause at a minimum a hell of a lot of panic, in which people can get injured, trampled to death kind of thing. So yeah, I think, I'm not a peace bond specialist. I get why it's part of the tool set that we have, but it's certainly far from ideal. The only way to guarantee that, if you know somebody that's planning an act of violence or is radicalized to that extent, the only way to really prevent it is to arrest, lay charges, and hold pending trial. Right. But we see enough society that doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, on the heels of what you just said there, Phil, I think the 420 peace bond is a valuable tool if it's followed up with something as rigorous as surveillance or a Part 6 wiretap.
Yeah.
I think for the peace bond to really work effectively, I think that's lost a little bit on the courts, in so much as we're giving the police and law enforcement the tool to have this person out of custody. because that's a valuable intel tool, is to have the person out of custody, because as you know, it's difficult from inside, not impossible, but difficult from inside to run an operation or to wreak havoc on Union Station, for example, or any other institution. But at the end of the day, I think that's sometimes where, no, without revealing police practice here, I think that's sometimes where law enforcement generally across Canada falls short, is that we do a lot of front end loading on cases. We do a lot of sourcing of information, whether it's static surveillance, photographic, wiretaps, whatever the case may be. We get the person before the court. The courts decide that a 420 peace bond is going to work and be effective. But there are times when Canadian law enforcement doesn't have the back end approach. They don't put the same vigor into the next thing, because we've done it. Let's just move on. We've got him. He's going to abide by his conditions, or she's going to abide by her conditions, and we can move on. Aren't we great? High fives all around everybody. So can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the rigor that's required to see something from start to finish, and how we can perhaps work around that apathetic mentality we have as Canadians, where that apathy needs to be removed, and how do we move forward in that regard?
Yeah. So thanks for that, Craig. You know an awful lot more about peace bonds, but I think you're absolutely right. I think there's an assumption that we've been there, done that. This person no longer poses a threat because they're under a peace bond. But you're right. It's all about resources, and I don't think Canadians understand the resources involved in doing an investigation. So I like to joke with Canadians that you think surveillance is Nick Nolte and Eddie Murphy in a car, right, sitting outside someone's house. That's not surveillance. So an investigator that I used to work with at the service would tell me that if you really want to investigate someone thoroughly, and that's human, that's Section 21 warrants or Part 6 warrants, that's surveillance, that's everything else, it's minimum 20 to 40 people per individual. Now, when I was at the service, strictly on the counterterrorism side, we were aware of about 200 people that had come across our radar, and some were just peripheral, some were more central. Most people who came across our radar didn't do anything, because most people are cowards or complete morons that couldn't organize a piss up in a bar. But you still have to do your due diligence to determine if that person, in fact, is warrants surveillance, warrants an investigation, and that takes resources. So if you have 200 people, and it takes 20 to 40 people just to look at somebody, you're talking between 4,000 and 8,000 people. Now, Toronto Police Service is obviously the largest municipal police force in the country. You don't have 8,000 officers sitting around waiting to be deployed to do investigation. That's just not the way, with all the other things you need to do, right? And CSIS at its height was maybe 3,500 people, of only a fifth of which were actually investigators and surveillance. Everything else is the kind of the infrastructure that goes to help create a modern intelligence service. I wish Canadians had a better understanding as to what that means, so that they wouldn't say, oh, well, peace bond, we're all safe now because Buddy Boy is on a peace bond, and I can go to the grocery store and not worry about him showing up with an AK-47 and wasting 30 people at the fresh vegetable bar kind of thing. To me, it's about education. And I think that education extends to government people as well. I mean, I certainly have been in meetings in the past where I've heard senior government officials say some truly ludicrous things that belie an incredible lack of understanding of what intelligence is, what danger is, what threat is, what risk management is. And I think it's incumbent upon us to provide that education, which is one of the reasons why I've been so active since my so-called retirement in 2015. I don't have all the answers. I wasn't an investigator. I was an analyst. I worked with investigators, but I also think I have a bit of an inside track on, what this whole thing's about. And if people aren't educated, then they can't make educated decisions.
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead, Jim. Sorry.
It's not at all. I think there's a naivete that people that don't do our type of work carry with them, and don't want to believe that somebody could act out in a violent way. But good or bad, when there's an incident and something happens, that's exactly what I would. Yes, it is my fault, but that's exactly what I would anticipate somebody to do, a criminal or a terrorist. So
Yeah.
it's not a surprise to me. But what's surprising to me, and I'll kind of bring it full circle, is that people are extremely naive in spite of their education and on human behavior and the flaw that humans have. I mean, it's any technology that you pick, the human is the problem, is why it can't function. And then, but with that said, I'm back to our, cherishing our freedoms and our liberty. And if anything, I think that people need to be educated on is how lucky we truly are. I mean, most people came to this country as immigrants to escape communism.
My grandparents, yeah.
Yeah, and so I just keep doing what you're doing. We're here to help in that.
Well, thanks, Jim.
Again,
Let me give you two examples to pick up on that. We're living in an era now where if you're in law enforcement or you're in security intelligence, you're actually part of the problem. So we hear this horse shit about systemic racism and every law enforcement agencies from St. John's to Victoria. We hear the security service is rife with racism and anti-gay and all kinds of stuff. To which I answer, are there individuals who are racist? 100%. We've all met them. We all knew them, and they should be taken to task. And if they can't mend their ways, they should be fired. It's as simple as that.
100%. We don't want to work with those individuals either.
Exactly. But we now have a public which has no trust in what we're doing. And,
yes.
and on the naivete side, let me give you another example, Jim, which really just burns my butt. There's this debate in Canada now about what to do with Canadians who joined ISIS in the 2010s. Now, somewhere around 200 Canadians are believed to have traveled abroad as terrorists. I wrote a book about it in 2017 called Western Foreign Fighters. And there's a few dozen Canadians that joined ISIS. Some of them are dead, which is, I'm sorry to say this, but a dead terrorist is a good terrorist because you don't have to worry about him anymore. And some of them are languishing in so-called refugee camps in Syria and Iraq, et cetera, and they want to come home. We have a lobby group in this country, and I know because I've interviewed them, who say that we have an obligation as Canadians to rescue our fellow citizens who are sitting in abysmal conditions in these refugee camps. To which my retort is, so wait now, we have Canadians who made a conscious decision to join a terrorist group that they knew exactly what they were joining. This is a group that raped little girls, killed people, burned people alive, drowned people in cages, threw people off buildings, held public executions. They made this decision. Now they find themselves in abject conditions, and you want me to fly over there and bring them home? There's a few problems with this. One is that if we bring them home, the chances of successful prosecution are as close to zero as possible. Why? Because all the evidence is over there. The witnesses are over there. So if you're going to try them, they should be tried over there. People said, well, the Syrians, it's not fair justice, which I say, well, don't do stupid shit in Syria then. I mean, I don't agree with capital punishment personally, but if you don't want to be executed, don't do dumb things in a country where capital punishment is the ultimate reward for your acts kind of thing. Secondly, the threat that they pose here is indeterminate. They've changed their minds. You know how many times I've heard that one, right? Okay, we had a woman walk into a Canadian Tire in 2018. She was ISIS wannabe. Now, she was pretty stupid, and she ended up, hurting nobody. But it was her intent to carry out a terrorist attack because she wanted to join ISIS and came back to Canada.
Well, what do I find fascinating about that particular case? Because I am familiar with it. The judge sent her, I believe, a couple, if not 3 times, for psychiatric assessment. And she said, no, what I'm doing is totally rational based on my belief system. Yeah. And again, the naivete of the judge, educated, obviously, to say, well, no, there must be something wrong. In fact, they found out she had no mental illness.
Well, and that's actually a good point, Jim, because certainly in my very first book that looked at radicalization to Islam as extremism, very few terrorists actually are mentally ill. They're as sane as you and I, which is maybe an assumption we shouldn't make. But it's the assumption that only a crazy person would join Al-Qaeda. No, they're not crazy. They believe in the ideology. The other thing is that what's happened is that we have lobby groups in this country that are painting the ISIS terrorists as victims. I said they're not victims. The victims are the Yazidis. And I know of at least one case here in Canada where a Yazidi refugee who came to our shores for protection, now living in Canada, recognize one of our ISIS tormentors who'd come back to Canada as well. This person is not sitting in jail. This person is walking the streets of the city. In other words, no charges were laid because there's not enough evidence. The Crown wouldn't get a successful prosecution. You would know, Craig, and you guys both know, the Crown doesn't go to court unless it has a really good chance of winning. Why would the Crown waste taxpayer funds in a case that's going to go nowhere? And because the evidence and witnesses are all over there, that's where the trials need to be held. So bringing these, poor victims home, they're not victims, they're terrorists, and the chances of successful prosecution are very, very low. We're going to basically give these people a freebie. So it's okay you joined ISIS. It's okay that you posted stuff online supporting the group. It's okay that you call for people to be killed, because we're not going to charge you, which means you'll spend no time behind bars because, well, it's okay that you did that. What kind of message is that sending to other Canadians?
So, I will hypothesize that the Crown, where they say in the open court that they have no reasonable prospect for conviction, they're well aware of the political ramifications that if they do go to trial and they do not get a conviction or have somebody plead to a lesser included offense, that the political backlash for the sitting government will be huge, and oftentimes irreparable, right?
Not to mention the lawsuit that the so-called victims. I mean, so just so you're aware, gentlemen, the going rate for former terrorists in Canada is 10.5 million.
Yes.
Omar Khadr got it. The three amigos that were in Syria got it. I mean, the lawsuits, I can't count how many lawsuits. So when these ISIS terrorists eventually come home, which they will, if they can make it of their own accord, we can't not take them back. They're Canadians. We don't have to get them. So they can arrange a ticket on Air Canada or whatever, fine. We have to take them back. If they're going to use the sob story that Canada didn't help them. Remember, but I keep saying, this is not a vacation gone wrong. This isn't like, you've gone to Cuba for the week and all of a sudden a typhoon came through and you had to be rescued. These were people that joined a terrorist group. We have no obligation to rescue them. They're going to come back. They're going to lawyer up. They're going to say, my rights were violated as a Canadian. And like I said, the going rate right now is 10.5 million. Maybe with inflation, it's 11.5 million. I have no idea. But taxpayer money is going to be used to pay out people that joined ISIS. Mark my words, gentlemen, it's going to happen.
Well, the precedent is there. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought I heard you some time ago, perhaps on the radio, and you're making a distinction. Basically, what you're saying is that why don't we just charge people with first-degree murder rather than trying this terrorism, something that's very difficult to prove, and really, everybody has a different definition of terrorism. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure.
Because I think it's a brilliant idea.
Well, thank you. I have them once in a while, especially when my wife gives them to me. Canadians may be very surprised to learn there was no terrorist offense in Canada prior to 9/11. The Anti-Terrorism Act came out in December of 2001, after 9/11. Prior to that, we had terrorism in Canada. We had the FLQ in the 60s and 70s. We had the Armenian attacks in Ottawa in the early 80s. I was in Ottawa for both of them. We had, of course, Air India in 85. Yeah. We had Canadians joining Islamist extremist groups in the 80s and 90s. When the Crown went to court, it couldn't charge them with terrorism because there was no statute for terrorism back then. So what did it charge them with? First-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, second-degree murder, whatever kind of thing. And they got successful prosecutions. The Air India guys were never jailed for terrorism.
Right.
They were jailed for murder. And as you said, Jim, the problem with terrorism is murder or conspiracy to commit murder, but for a specific reason. Now, under the criminal code, section 83.01, terrorism is defined as a serious act of violence that's carried out for political, ideological, or religious reasons. The problem is, you mentioned terrorism not having a definition, and it doesn't, at least not a consistent one across the board. What's an ideology? Where's that defined in the criminal code? What's a religion? Where's that defined in the criminal code? It's not. So if you're the Crown, you can prove the act pretty easily, or the intent to carry out the act, hopefully, in case that, the RCMP have acted in advance and arrested somebody before they actually carry out any harm. You can demonstrate the intention to carry out the act, or the act itself, post facto. What's harder to prove is the motivation behind that act. But why is it that under the criminal code, if you're charged with first-degree murder, nobody cares why you wanted to commit first-degree murder? Did you intend to or commit it? Is the answer yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then you're found guilty and you sue for jail time. We could do terrorism a lot more easily if we ignored the motivation aspect and simply relied on the same criminal code that we've done for 150 years prior to 9/11 and use that to go to court and lay charges. And the other thing, too, which people don't realize, the penalty for terrorism is the exact same as the penalty for first-degree murder. In other words, it's not a longer sentence for becoming a terrorist.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and you guys would appreciate this, we have different legislation for hate crime in Canada. So if I kill you, and it turns out I killed you, I'm thinking of the case in London, Ontario. So I'm from London, right? The guy that hit the Pakistani family there a couple of summers ago. That strikes me as probably a hate crime. So he targeted them because they were Pakistani.
Yes.
What they were wearing, color of their skin, whatever kind of thing. He's been charged with terrorism, which I don't really get at this point because I haven't seen the evidence pointing to that. But if he's found guilty of first-degree murder and it turns out to be a hate crime, the courts have actually a mechanism to increase the sentence because hate crime is seen as a different form of murder. The sentence can be longer in that case. So, in other words, why wouldn't you use a murder, because it's the same sentence as terrorism anyway, and then push for a hate crime where those conditions warrant and get a longer time behind bars?
Yeah, interesting perspective. I just want to finish up. Again, in the paper, there's some conjecture that perhaps an MP influenced the early return of the two Michaels. Do you have anything on that?
It seems to me, and again, I'm not a China specialist, but we've got an intelligence service which has been saying this for 30 years. My guess is that the leaked report, and just for the record, guys, I don't support leaks because I took a note to maintain secrecy until my dying day. I understand the frustration behind the leak, but I simply can't support it. Based on what I've seen, this is pretty solid intelligence. It looks like a wiretap to me, where they would have gotten it from. They would have gotten a Section 21 warrant. It seems to me that the information is pretty solid. Obviously, the MP has resigned from the party, trying to clear his name kind of thing, but I don't know. The information is pretty damning as far as I can see. I don't know how he gets out of this one. And if, in fact, it turns out that he did do this, and I guess we're going to find out, it's consistent with what we know what China does. And I'd be surprised if he's the only MP that is acting in this way based on, whether it's money he received for his campaign or pressure. A lot of these people have relatives back home. I've met with Uyghur Canadians, and they've been told, shut your pie hole, because if you keep talking about Uyghur persecution in China, you've got relatives back home who may get a visit from the local police officer and kind of thing. So I'm not surprised at all by it, Jim. I think there's much there to support the allegations, and I guess we'll see where the government decides to take this.
So what do we do as average Canadians? It's got to be more than just vote next time. There's got to be is it education? Is it getting people to sit down and have a conversation?
What do we do? Well, we listen to podcasts like this. We listen to podcasts like mine. We become informed Canadians. We don't assume things. When you work in intelligence, it's all about source of information. How good is your source? How reliable is your source? Now that I'm on the outside, my only sources of information are OSINT, open source information.
Right.
I am careful what I read and what I don't read. Some things I think are more reliable than others. I don't watch Fox News because I don't think it's reliable.
You know what? I find all of the major news suspect now. One side's as bad as the other. BBC's not too bad. You get more information from around the world that you don't. Our news is typically North American, but
I'm glad you've raised that.
Reading and fact checking for sure.
I'm glad you've raised that, Jim. I'm a big fan of the BBC, and let me just tell you a little anecdote, maybe to finish up here. I mean, I always thought very highly of the CBC, maybe because I'm a patriotic Canadian.
Sure.
I can't read the CBC anymore. It's so bloody biased. I can predict the 5 of the top 10 stories on their website every morning in advance. I'll know they're going to cover these 5 themes. I don't care about those themes personally. I'm not going to go into them. And so the CBC was my homepage when I boot up my computer in the morning and open up Explorer or whatever, Well,
again, I can't disagree with you. It used to be the reliable
Yeah.
Canadian news network. We all grew up with it. Yeah.
Yeah. I've changed my homepage from CBC to BBC. So when I first get up in the morning, the first thing I see before I even open my email is the BBC homepage, and I look at what the BBC is reporting, and I see what they think is making news right now. I like their objectivity, and yeah, they're not perfect, but yeah, it's gotten to the point where I can no longer trust the CBC. Let me give you again one small example: the arrests that were made in Montreal, the ISIS guy.
Yeah.
Aside from one very, very, very tiny story, have you guys seen anything on this case? Crickets. No. And yet, if he'd been, giving a Zig Heil salute or a far right guy, there would have been 1,000 articles on him on the CBC. But the fact that he's an ISIS wannabe, nobody cares at the CBC anymore.
That's another topic we can maybe pick up another time. This
absolutely
right-wing extremism. To me, it's an amorphous group of confused people that are, going down rabbit holes on the internet. But again, we both, myself and Craig, we've done this for a long, long time. Yeah. And on the boots on the ground, I'm not really seeing it.
No, well, I'm glad you.
I'm saying it's not there.
No.
I don't think it's pronounced as what some people might like it to be.
It's not. And I think we should meet together, guys, to talk about this specific topic, because I have a lot to say about it. But just, a spoiler alert, the far right threat is real. It certainly is greater than when I worked at CSIS. When I worked at CSIS, we weren't looking at the far right because we looked at them in the 90s. And these guys couldn't organize a piss up in a bar. They were useless. Sure. That's changed. However, the fact remains, the single greatest terrorist threat globally is Islamist terrorism. They carry out 99.9% of the attacks around the world and cause 99.9% of the casualties. Mm-hmm. We here in Canada have forgotten that because we've been led to believe by the government that if you even use the term Islamist extremism, you're racist.
You're a foe.
Yep. So,
yeah.
Enough said, gentlemen.
I mean, again, it's history. You have to go back and study things. Yeah. I mean, I go into mosque and ask the imam about passages in the Quran so I can, learn to understand it.
Exactly.
My history, and not only North American history, but world history, and how it all got us to where we are.
You can't ignore it. Those who forget their history.
Right. Yeah. So again, great interview. Always a pleasure to speak to you. We will pick up on the right-wing extremism.
Please do.
I do agree that it's there, but we just needs to be fleshed out a little bit so we can people can understand it a little bit better.
Sounds good, sir.
No, that's great. Great podcast, Phil. Great interview.
Thanks, guys.
Look forward to speaking to you very soon.
Absolutely. Can I just do one small plug, guys, before I leave?
Yeah, absolutely.
So my most recent book is called The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. It was initially self-published in January of 2020. It's been put out by, 2021. It's been republished by Double Dagger Books in Toronto, which is a small niche security and military publisher. They started out in 2021. It's available on Amazon on a Double Dagger site. And it's basically looking at terrorism going all the way back to 1867.
Oh, great.
And the sources for my book, with one exception, were all former RCMP, law enforcement, and CSIS who worked on counterterrorism and lent their perspective to sort of flesh out my own perspective working in counterterrorism at CSIS in the 2000s. So if you want to give your listeners want to get a copy, it's available online.
Yeah, you know what? I was in Indigo the other day and I couldn't find it, so I will go online and get it.
It should be there now. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. So that's great. So again, thanks very much. Be safe, and we'll talk to you soon.
You too, guys. Take care. Thanks.